Hey gang, welcome to another episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Up this week, a couple of creepy law enforcement tales to keep you awake at night. Some are paranormal, some a little bit more straightforward, and some are just creepy. Quick note, I'm working on a collaboration now that I've got a little more time on my hands, so look for that coming up with a name I'm sure most of you know. And I'm looking for your scary stories as always, especially Halloween stories. I'm looking to put together a huge show of stories focused on one of my favorite holidays. Do we even consider it a holiday? Of course we do. Send anything you've got to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Now, let's get moving. A child's footprint. Back when I was working as a cop on a military base, I loved working night shift. Didn't deal with 99% of the bullshit that the day shift had to deal with, and what little stuff we did deal with was usually really interesting. Almost every building on a base is alarmed, and the alarms are tied right into the desk, so we know the instant they go off. When we get an alarm activation, we close the base and go check the building, pull on all the doors, see if we can get in, that sort of thing. If we can, we go into the building and secure it. Check all the doors and corners to see if someone set the alarm off. Well, one night I was on patrol with my Alpha, and we get called to respond to an alarm activation at the elementary school. So we go, secure the building, and call in that the building is all secure. No problem. We kept patrolling. About 15 or 20 minutes go by, and we get another alarm activation. We get back out there and check, and now there is a maintenance door open that leads into a boiler room. Nothing in it, so we close it, lock it, and get out. Another 20 minutes, another alarm. We respond, and all the doors are still locked, and we can't get in. And the maintenance door is locked too. We call in the all clear. This time my buddy and I sit on opposite sides of the school and watch to see if someone is coming and yanking on the doors hard enough to set the alarms off. We're sitting there watching, and nothing happens. And right as we're about to leave, another alarm activation goes off as we're sitting there. We inform the desk that we'd like the building manager on site to help us secure the interior and to let us in. It's now like 3 in the morning. The building custodian shows up and we start doing a walkthrough, checking all the classrooms and checking all the maintenance rooms. And that's when we see one of the maintenance doors open with the lights on in the room. Now, this room is literally the size of a closet. We walk down there and look in. No one's there, and it's the kind of door that locks when it closes. We look in there and we find a single footprint of a bare foot made in water. It was from a small child. Freaked the living hell out of us because no one reported a missing child and the entire building was clear and still locked up. No one left, no one entered, and we checked every inch of that damn place, literally a 3-hour deep sweep including ceiling tiles. Freaked the ever-loving shit out of us, and to this day, my partner refuses to go into that school. I gotta admit, schools are really fucking spooky when they're empty. Suicide contact. I'm a security patrol officer in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I work 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I have the largest security beat in the Scottsdale desert, and part of my job is to respond to alarm calls in these isolated mansions throughout Scottsdale, Cave Creek, and Carefree. One night, I got an alarm call at a small airport where the rich play with their airplanes. It's called Sky Ranch Airport. Part of the airport is residential homes with built-in hangars, and that's where this alarm was tripped one morning at 02:30. On arrival, I went through the normal alarm process. Called dispatch to make a call to the homeowners, and no one was supposed to be there. It was vacant. After I made the call, I knocked on the front door very aggressively just to make sure if someone was there, they'd hear me before I made entry. In the past, I've walked in on homeowners when they didn't know I was coming. Anyway, as I walked towards the front door, I heard a little shuffling noise behind it. Very faint but loud enough to be noticed. That being the case, I rang the doorbell and knocked on the door longer than usual. But nothing. So I then began the perimeter check, and I found the back sliding door handle was broken, but there was a little note on the inside that read, "Handle broken," and the realtor's name was signed to it. The realtor had also placed a metal rod down to keep the sliding door from opening. I finished the perimeter check and then called dispatch to let them know I was going to make entry. The house was beautiful and everything was fine, so I wrote out my entry slip and was resetting the alarm. But a fault showed up on the display that read, Zone 35 back room door. And at that very moment, my supervisor called me via radio and asked if I knew anything about the house I was in. What he told me, more than anything, just annoyed the shit out of me. He said back in 2008, the previous homeowner had committed suicide by the front door with a shotgun when the economy crashed. He'd left behind a wife and 3 kids. I know he was just trying to scare me, so I brushed it off and resumed my business. I walked to the backsliding door, and lo and behold, the metal rod had been removed, and the sliding door was open about 4 inches. I got to admit, it was really creepy. The house had motion sensors, including sensors on the door itself, and none of them were showing up as fault. I put the rod back into its original place and armed the system. A few months later, I had an alarm call at a different house, and this time Scottsdale police assisted me. After the call was over and done with, we stood outside the house bullshitting, and I asked the police if they knew about the house in Sky Ranch Airport where the guy had supposedly killed himself. One of the officers said he was one of the first officers on scene shortly after the homeowner blew his brains out, and yeah, that did happen. They confirmed the suicide, and if I ever have to respond to that house again, I'm going with backup. A bizarre abduction. My old roommate's dad was a former naval officer and then an FBI agent. 20 years in the Navy and 12 or 15 years or so in the FBI. One of his strangest stories was from his FBI days, and I'll paraphrase it here. It was a kidnapping case. This girl disappeared from her grandparents' RV sometime between 5 p.m. and midnight. They were up in front on the road, and the next thing they know, she was gone. She was supposed to be sleeping in the back. One stop at a rest stop, then they were in stop-and-go traffic, so they figure she must have popped out the door at some point. This happened near the California-Nevada border. So we met them again and talked to them, and this is within a day or so, and the girl's still missing. No sign of her. She was only 15. Local PD theory is she ran off because she's 15 and wants to get away from her lame grandparents for the summer. But there's a busted window with glass inside the vehicle, so we're treating it like a possible kidnapping. After a few hours, there's a couple of different theories on the case still. Again, one that she ran off, another that she got snatched. Nobody's seen the girl in almost 2 days now, and disappearing in the desert for a young girl is not an easy thing to do. Next thing you know, we got a phone call. A report of a naked girl, lost and confused, picked up by some trucker on a 2-lane road out in a town called Nipton. It runs into I-15 between Barstow and Vegas, right near the border. She matches our description, so me and 3 guys head out there to meet with the sheriff who's got her. Turns out she's our girl. Turns out she's fine. No bruises, no exposure, no rape, nothing. Completely healthy, completely fine. Even cleaned up like she just took a shower. Wouldn't tell us a damn thing because she couldn't remember a damn thing. According to her, 1 minute she was in the RV, and the next she was naked walking down the side of the road in 100-degree heat. We talked to her for 2 hours while her grandparents headed out to pick her up. We had our social services lady talk to her. Nothing. And over my career, I've seen people hiding things. This girl wasn't hiding anything. She honestly didn't remember. Damnedest thing. Anyway, the girl was found, she was fine, so we turned her back over to the local PD to figure out what happened and determined if any charges needed to be pressed. I kept in touch with a guy I knew out there because I was curious to hear what would happen with this story, and we also happened to be in a fantasy football league together. A few months later, he told me the parents sent the girl to a therapist to look for repressed memories to make sure she wasn't raped or something. The therapist said she seemed fine, and honestly had no recollection of her time at all, and doesn't think there's any point to delving much further into things, and she has no symptoms, and is largely more confused by the reaction than the event. So, to this day, we've got a busted RV window with glass on the inside, likely from a moving RV on a jam-packed freeway or something, likely in broad or lightly fading sunlight, and 0 witnesses. A 15-year-old gets out, or is taken out, and is taken somewhere safe nearby for almost 2 days, and then is stripped naked without being touched sexually, cleaned up, and deposited on the side of a separate road a few miles away. She didn't have a drug in her system. She remembers nothing at all, and nobody knows what happened to her clothes or anything else. It's been almost 20 years since this happened, and I can't figure out what the hell went on with that girl. It still bugs me at night that I have no way to explain it aside from saying that she just lied the entire time. But I know liars, and I am sure she wasn't lying at all. Backwoods Scumbags, submitted by Officer John. This took place in 2006. It was my 10th year as a Leo. I'm not saying exactly where this happened, and you can call me John, as what I'm sharing with you and your listeners can't be linked back to me. Leos see and deal with all kinds of shit that most people would not know what to do with, and none of us are perfect. There's so much going wrong in the world today, and we all have a microscope pointed at us that it's hard to even write this. I want to say this from the get-go. You may not like the police, you may have had a bad run-in with some, but please hold your judgment of me and my story until it's finished. I work in a fairly remote area of Nebraska. In fact, there are only 10 full-time Leos in our county outside of our chief, and let me tell you, our days are long and sometimes boring, but they can also be intense, and stuff happens that burn memories into your soul. One afternoon, I was midway through a double. That's 20 hours straight with 4 overtime hours, one of the only perks we get through our union. I was lucky enough to be close to home and was having an early supper with my wife and kids before heading back out. Again, another perk. It's great to be able to see your family for a bit in the middle of your workday. Lots of people don't have that. I'll never forget, we were having spaghetti that my wife made, and I was happy because a hot meal on a cold afternoon and night hit the spot. It was early November when this happened. As I kissed my wife and bounced my son up and down on my knee, I went 10-8 and headed out into the cold. Not long after I drove away from my house, the radio picked up and I heard it.
All units 1059, 911 dispatch is advising current 1034 at 2438 J Road. Ambulance is en route for suspected firearm discharge.
That wasn't too far from me, and I knew I'd likely be the first person there, and I had a suspicion of what was going on. We all knew that address well and who lived there. 34 in, 10-4, will advise upon arrival. Is this who I think it is? I said back.
Copy 34, yes it is. 911 is still connected with caller.
Great. Just fucking great. We all know who this family was, and we all hated going out there. My colleagues and I always keep things clean and never shirk on our duties, but this was the Smith family. Again, not their name, and I hate to admit I feel this way, but they were some of the most disgusting backwoods, middle-of-nowhere trolls anywhere in the United States. 12 of them living under one roof, welfare, a lot of teeth broken off at the gum line, just a sad, sad picture of America gone wrong. The father, Bill, hadn't worked a day in his life, and his wife, Belinda, was just a baby maker, and neither of them gave a shit about their kids or the quote-unquote house they lived in. They basically lived one step up from squalor, and like I said, we hated going out there. The only constant out there was trouble, booze, and calls to us. Sometime in the late 90s, they had gotten permission to get foster kids, and that's where I think most of the kids came from. Just another way to get money from the state and not have to do anything for it. The kids ranged from 22 all the way down to 7, and they were all crammed into a 3-bedroom farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. No running water. It was just gross. So here I am, heading out to what I'm sure is a booze-fueled argument with one of them shooting off a firearm, when I see a figure running towards me on the road. It was a young girl, and she had blood on her pants and shirt. I knew right away she was one of the Smith clan. Radio 34 in, 1079, I said into my radio, asking to go to our emergency channel.
Go ahead, 34,
she said after we flipped. I have a young female running towards me that looks severely injured on J Road about a mile from the Smith residence in the 1034 call. Please advise.
Copy 34, Sergeant advises you to handle this situation. Units en route to disturbance call.
I pull over and immediately notice this young woman, maybe 12 or 13, and she has no shoes on and has a look of horror on her face. Blood has smeared her cheeks, and all I could think of was that last scene in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the young woman running for her life. Radio, 1055 to location on J Road if possible. 1020 less than 1 mile from 2348 J Road. Female in distress. Leaving vehicle to assess.
10434, ambulance to your location. Should be there in minutes.
I get out of my Crown Vic and the young woman ran straight to me and I blocked her with my door. She was crying and screaming and I asked her if she was shot or stabbed and where. I quickly pulled gloves on and told her that it was going to be okay, but I needed to know where she was hurt. And this is where it gets messed up. The little girl stops screaming and just stares at me for a minute. Then she bursts into tears and crumples to the ground. I move around my door and ask her again where she's hurt. Then I notice two things: a tear in her pants on her left thigh, a faint smear of blood on her khaki pants near her crotch, and blood on her face. She's blubbering and trying to talk to me, and I reach out for her arm and tell her that it's going to be okay. She was obviously cut or shot, as the tear in her thigh was reflective of something that grazed her and caused some decent bleeding, but it wasn't anything more than a fairly good slash. The girl then just started saying, "He did this. He did this. It's not my fault. It's not my fault." I told her it wasn't her fault, and then I could hear the ambulance roaring down the road behind me. I again checked her bleeding, and it was more gory than anything that was putting her in danger. But she was in light clothing in the freezing air, so I helped her up as the paramedics pulled up and jumped into action. 2 other cars drove around us on the way to the Smith farm, and I gave the EMS guys a bit of information that I had, and they got her inside and did their thing. I got back in my cruiser and radioed I was on my way up J Road. When I got there, 2 of my colleagues were already out of their vehicles, and from the chatter that I heard on the radio, 911 was still on the line, but no one was there anymore, talking back to them. Luke approached the door and banged on it, yelling out that we were there. "Sheriff's deputies, open the door." Nothing happens, but we can see people moving around inside and taking their good old time coming to the door. Pete and I head around the opposite sides of the house looking into the windows, but can't see anything through the shit caked all over them. Luke yells for us to come back to the front and the door is now open. Mr. Smith is standing there looking like the white trash POS he is and asks us what's all the fuss. Pete tells him about the 911 call, and in the excitement, I yell out about the little girl I just saw. The slob lets us in, and we ask for whomever is still on the 911 call. But Smith and his wife, who has now emerged from a back room stinking of BO, booze, and feces, says we're wrong and have no reason to be there. There is no one on 911. 2 more cars pull up. One is our sergeant, and he's not taking any bullshit from these people. He tells them they either play it straight or everyone's going to jail. Everything goes quiet. Then we can hear a muffled sound, and over the radio we're informed the call is still active, but again, no one is responding to the 911 dispatcher. "Where is the phone?" asks my sergeant. The 2 morons just look at one another, and Sarge points a finger at them and barks out, "I want everyone in this farm accounted for right this second." Belinda lights up a cigarette. Sarge tells her to put it out, and Luke and Pete go outside to look around for the other kids. As I move towards the door Mrs. Smith came out of. The smell was awful as I walked down the hall, with the Smiths yelling at me that I had no right to be going there. Sarge held them at bay, telling them we were on a distress call and I did have the right to be there. I open a door and there are like 5 kids sitting on the floor playing some sort of board game, and they all look up at me scared. I gently ask if they are all right, and I get a lot of nods and vacant stares. A little boy asks if he was in trouble, and I said, "Why would you be in trouble?" "Mama says we'll be in trouble if you ask us anything." I shook my head no, and then asked if anyone had made a phone call to the police. Another little girl, the youngest I guessed, pointed to the wall, and I figured she meant the next room over. I smiled at her and backed out of the room and listened for the muffled sound. That's when I heard sobbing coming from a closet that had the door closed and a screwdriver wedged into a bar keeping it shut. I cautiously opened the door after pulling out the screwdriver and shined my maglite into the face of a boy about 12 years old. He was crying and had a huge welt on his face that I knew would be bruising up in no time. "Come on out of there, partner. It's okay," I said. I heard a shriek from the fat woman and more yelling from Mr. Smith. "Did you call 911? The boy nodded, looking down. "Where's the phone?" I asked. He motioned to the other bedroom, and I asked him to show me. Suddenly, Mrs. Smith is right behind me screaming that I can't talk to her kid without her being there, and I shut the door and held it closed with my foot as the kid scrambled underneath what was supposed to be a bed, but was nothing more than a piece of plywood on some cinder blocks. He reached under it and handed me a cell phone that was still open, with dispatch still on the line. They knew we were on the scene, but it stayed on the line just in case. Mrs. Smith is going completely apeshit now, and a female sheriff, let's call her Trudy, has arrived and is handling her. "Is this your parents' phone?" I asked the little boy. He shook his head. I thought it odd that something like this would be out here at this shitbox. "Whose phone is it, my man?" "Maddie's," he said, barely above a whisper. It then dawned on me. Maddie. The only one of the older kids that was worth a shit. He was the only one who went to school and graduated, and he must have been about 19 by now. I knew he worked at the supermarket in town, and I know he wanted to go to community college, but he gave a lot of his money to his family because he knew his foster parents didn't take care of his brothers and sisters. "Does Maddie still live here? Where is he? Does he know you have his phone?" The boy nodded and told me that Maddie didn't live there anymore. He had a place with his girlfriend and was at work right now. He had been out there earlier and let his brother have the phone to play some games and was going to come back for it later that night. I asked him what happened, and through crying he told me a fucked up story of what had happened. Before Maddie had left, he had had words with Toby, a 16-year-old living there, about him being odd to his sister. It turns out that was the one I found on the road. The little guy couldn't say what was going on because he didn't understand it, but after Maddie left, Toby had taken his sister to the barn out back, and she had come back screaming out and bloodied in a bad way. This little guy said he wanted to call Maddie, but it kicked in that he had Maddie's phone, so he did the only thing he knew to do, and that was tell his father, Bill. Apparently Bill had told him to shut up and that he didn't want cops around, and that's when the girl burst into the house with her clothes torn, screaming, and she was bleeding. Toby came in after her and chased her out the front door with a rifle, took a shot at her, grazing her leg. The kid grabbed the phone to try to call 911, and Belinda tried to stop him. He ran and hid the phone before both Bill and Belinda beat him and locked him in the closet. We accounted for all the kids. CPS came out and took them all away, and the search for Toby was on. It didn't take long. We found the asshole just a few miles away on a road, kind of wandering around. So the full story is the worst. Toby was trying to get his sister to have sex, and when she wouldn't, he started hitting her, and that's when she got her first period, and barely understood what was happening to her biologically, let alone this physical beating. I'll never forget that poor little girl screaming to me that it wasn't her fault. That's the kind of thing that stays with you. The kids went into different foster care, and 2 older ones who weren't there at the time moved away. The state pressed Bill and Belinda with a bunch of abuse, negligence, and obstruction charges, you name it. They both got time and are still serving sentences. Toby got out of Junior Disneyland Hotel, this sick little shit, but I heard he's back in jail for something else, but it didn't happen around here, so I'm not really sure what it was. I still see Maddie once in a while, and I was always told by people in court that he hadn't forgiven himself for not being there for his sister and family, and that he still beats himself up about not taking care of them. I did run into him at a softball game one night, and I pulled him aside and told him that he had done enough, and that he and his little brother had saved their sister. If he hadn't have let that little kid play with his phone that night, the 911 call never would have been made, and things could have been a lot worse. Please don't take this as a story about blasting foster care. Foster care is a great thing, but there are some sick people out there, and it makes me angry that the system misses them from time to time. I've got lots more stories. I know this was super long, and I'm sure your peeps are ready for your next story, but I hope you read this. Take care. The Weird Screams. I once was called to a residence out in the boonies. This was in Wyoming, so the boonies really are the boonies. It was about 11 p.m., and it was about some suspicious activity. When my partner and I got there, we were told by the family living there that there were some very strange screams coming from a creek area about 1,000 feet behind their house. Sure enough, waiting outside on the porch with them for about a minute, I heard it. It was very hard to describe what it sounded like. It was like a woman in very severe distress, but higher pitched, and each scream lasted for about 10 or 15 seconds. It never sounded like it was saying anything. It just sounded like a cry of sheer terror. And it repeated itself over and over. We told the family we were going to investigate, so we just walked down to the creek since it was pretty nice out. We hear about 2 more screams, and they were getting louder as we approached the creek. By now, we're both kind of freaked out. There are 2 possibilities. Someone is getting murdered or maimed out in this creek bed, or maybe it's just a wild animal. As we approach the creek bed, we hear no screams for about 5 minutes. We search around and find nothing, yelling at the top of our lungs for somebody to come forward if they're out there. Then, we hear the exact same scream right behind us, exactly from where we had just come from. We got about halfway back to the house, and the scream came so loudly it seemed to be coming right next to us. We frantically shone our flashlights everywhere, and found nothing. No eyes from animals, no rustling of bushes, just silence. We trace our steps back, and the scream comes from around the creek again. This time it lasted about 30 seconds and was much louder than before. Our retreat became a little more hastened. By this time, we were both scared shitless and verified with the family to call us again if they heard it. They never did call again, and we just got the hell out of there. I still don't know what that was. I mean, as an avid outdoorsman, I know no animal makes a cry like that, especially one that can move stealthily without being spotted by flashlights. Something else that weirded me out was that it was completely silent while the screams were happening. During summer in Wyoming, there is always some type of ambient animal sounds. Frogs croaking, crickets, owls hooting, coyotes, etc., but there was nothing. Until we were leaving and the screams had stopped. Then the frogs started croaking. Man, it gives me the creeps just thinking about it still. The Horrendous Father. I live in a fairly small town. My dad was a cop for 10 years or so. My aunt works in the ER going on 11 years now, and at the time of this story, one of my best friend's brother-in-law was an EMT. They were all involved in this sick tale. One night there was a call about a domestic dispute. Then a 911 call from the same address from a woman who was just screaming and was then cut off. Of course, all kinds of units were sent immediately. It turned out a guy was high on drugs and had a freak out on his girlfriend, accusing her of cheating. He beat the shit out of her, broke several of her bones, and then he decided their 3-month-old baby wasn't his, picked up the infant by his feet and gutted him with a box cutter. When the cops showed up, he was beating on his girlfriend some more with a kitchen utensil. She was huddled over the baby, trying to shield him with her own body. They got the guy subdued, rushed the baby to the ER, attended to the woman in the ambulance out front, and sewed up several cuts on the man in the kitchen. The EMT tending to him was my friend's brother-in-law. The man was still on a high, but coming down and saying a lot of disgusting things about his girlfriend. My friend's brother-in-law slammed his head into the refrigerator, warning him to stop talking. A sergeant was in the room, saw this, and gave the EMT an approving nod. A few minutes later, the sergeant got fed up with the man's clearly unapologetic words and said, "Do you hear that woman crying? She trusted you to take care of her, loved you enough to give you a son, and look what you've done to both of them. She didn't cheat. We know you never let her leave the house, so how could she cheat? That little boy is your son, and you could have been a father to him and raised him to be a great man. Now you've taken his life. That woman who loved you so much is out there weeping because she's just lost her son and her boyfriend. Don't you care at all?" The man then said that if the baby didn't want him to kill it, it should have died before it was born, and that the woman deserved what she got because she was a dumb bitch, cheating or not. The sergeant lost his temper and shot the guy in the foot. My father witnessed all of this and later had to testify. My aunt said in the ER the baby was lying there and his intestines were literally laying next to him on a gurney, outside of his body. Every single person who worked on that baby requested therapy afterwards. The mom had some pretty bad internal bleeding, but my aunt said the most disturbing thing was hearing her scream for her baby. She said in all her years in the ER, she's never heard anyone scream like that. The mom and the baby actually both lived, but the baby had some serious brain damage because he didn't get enough oxygen to his brain because of a punctured lung. And the guy is in prison. I know he got drug charges, weapons charges, I guess there were unregistered guns found in the home as well as more drugs, domestic battery, attempted murder, and a few other things I'm not even sure of. I do know he had a long sentence, but I'm not sure how long. It's been a while. The sergeant and EMT were both fired for what they did to that guy that day. That was the hearing my dad had to testify in, along with some other officers and EMTs. The door at the end of the hall. Myself and a buddy on my squad responded to an alarm one night. The incident location was an old office building that had been converted to doctor's offices. There was a pharmacy attached to it, and our dispatch received a motion signal from an upstairs office. A key holder arrives on the scene, and we go in to secure the building. The stairs were locked behind a door that, of course, the key holder didn't have the keys to, so we took the elevator up to the second floor. Not the most tactically sound option, I know. The elevator opens to a pitch-black hallway, except for one overhead light at the end of the hall. We start checking doors, and so far all are secured. We get to the last office, and sure enough, the door is unlocked. We make entry and observe it to be an unused office. The door opened to a sizable waiting room and reception area, and there were about 10 or 12 exam rooms, all cleared with no hiccups. We exit the office, and immediately something seems off. That's when I realized the overhead light at the end of our hallway that had been on was now off, replaced by another light over by the elevators. I look at my squad mate. He is completely white. I ask him what he thinks is wrong, and he says, "Weren't all those doors we just checked closed and locked?" I said, "Yeah, so?" "Well, now they're all standing open." Sure enough, all the offices down the hallway we had just checked were now standing open. Pucker factor sinks in at this point. So we start clearing offices and securing offices, and we finish the last one, and on our way out, just before we turn the corner to get into the waiting area, the main door just slams shut. Then, our radios start going nuts with some kind of static feedback. And now I just want to get the hell out of there. We get back in the elevator and head down to the first floor to make contact with the key holder again. However, the key holder is nowhere to be found. I contact dispatch and request a callback number for the key holder so I can advise them of what we'd found. Dispatch states that the key holder was still en route to us and was advising an ETA of 5 more minutes. I advised dispatch that we had already been out with the key holder. Dispatch requests I give him a call. I do call in, and the dispatcher tells me there is no way we were out there with a key holder. She states that the alarm company had only just made contact with one. Eventually, the real key holder arrives on scene, and I ask her about the man that had let us in the building, the first key holder. She asked me to describe him, so I did. She states that sounds like it's one of the doctors that used to lease the office on the second floor, at the end of the hall. She then states that he had committed suicide at his summer home several days ago. I still won't go back to that office building. Thanks for listening, gang. Hope you liked this short volume of stories, and a little known fact about me. I almost became a state trooper, but that was an entire lifetime ago. Check out my weekly live radio call-in show, theedgeoftheunknown.com, and follow me on my social media outlets. Links are down below. And hey, even consider throwing me a tip on Patreon. It's as little as $1 per month for content I think most of you have come to realize you don't hear anywhere else. A link is also below for that. Thanks for liking, subscribing, and commenting on all my videos. And again, send me your stories at unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. Could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door. Or some backwoods shitheels from the middle of Nebraska. Fuck those people.